So thanks everybody for coming. As you know, the purpose of this seminar today is going to be, it's really going to be focused on, helping folks who are interested in studying some facet of the pandemic kind of develop their ideas and their methods. And so we're going to talk about things that would touch on the pandemic, both from a qualitative lens and from a quantitative lens. So the structure of things here today is we're going to kind of cover the first two items here are really kind of universal. So just getting at what are the challenges of learning about how different ways that the pandemic has impacted education. And I think Dr. Reid will talk a little bit about that. Then the next thing is going to be just general considerations for when you're designing research that is going to include some element of the pandemic as part of that. And then we will, then Dr. Reid will talk, more specifically about, qualitative perspectives and things that are relevant to qualitative approaches to research that would include, some sort of a focus on the pandemic. And then I'll do the same thing for quantitative. And then the plan is that we should have time at the end of this for sort of question and answer. Would request that we do questions and everything at the end because this is going to be recorded so that it can be viewed later on. And sort of selfishly, it just saves me a lot of editing time if the questions all kind of come in one block at the end versus having to edit out a couple minutes, throughout. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Reid. And since I am sharing my screen, just let me know when you're ready for me to advance the slides.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Burns. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. And those who are listening to this later, feel free to follow up with us if you have any questions that were unanswered. But as Dr. Burns said at the beginning, the general goal is the idea behind this is that many of you have reached out to us in classes, and as me, as kind of the mentor coordinator, you have ideas about studying the pandemic or want to study some aspect of the pandemic. Understandably so, it's impacted all of us. So we wanted to kind of lead a session of the challenges, opportunities within both of kind of the methodological approaches that are commonly used here. So I'll talk a little bit now about generally the challenges when we're considering studying the pandemic. So go ahead, Dr. Burns. So people, we probably use the word pandemic more than ever the last couple of years here. And I think one key thing to keep in mind as you're considering studying some aspect of the pandemic is that people define the pandemic differently. And that's everything from, when people started to get sick, in education, it's even underneath the umbrella kind of this definition, how we might define it from, in March 2020 or whenever schools went virtually, or there's just different definitions, ways people will define when the pandemic began, when it ended, how it occurred, and how it impacted certain people. And it's really important that that's not necessarily bad, but it can be confusing or challenging if you kind of leave it up to the discretion of somebody else to define it for you. So you want to be really clear and precise about what you mean about the pandemic, both in terms of kind of what aspect of it you're studying, how you are studying it. It's not different than defining other important terms kind of in your dissertation like you would. Like I always talk about, a veteran teacher. That could mean very different things to different people. As a veteran teacher, someone who's taught 5 years or someone who's been in the classroom 10 years. So just being very clear and precise about your definitions and how you're applying that definition to your work is really key, because just because, you're defining the pandemic one way doesn't mean it was the same for everyone. I guess what I'm trying to say is while everyone has experienced the pandemic in some capacity, how that experience has occurred is going to vary. So I think it's really important to define that and make sense of that up front before you even get into your research questions, certainly your data collection, those type of things. And Dr. Burns, you can feel free to jump in too.
Okay, great.
So as I mentioned, think about how you actually want to define, start or end, or if we're in an endemic, we hear all these things all the different time, but think carefully about your specific study. Do you want to start from a certain point kind of on the timeline? And there should be some meaning potentially behind that point you want to start. Like if you're sending out a survey, do you want to send it out and ask questions about things that happen between here and there and here? It's also important, I think, to keep in mind that, as we get further removed, especially from the initial stage of the pandemic, it's just important to think about the questions that you're asking of individuals. I know if we were all asked to think back, maybe 2 years, what was going on in March 2020 or something like that, it's a bit of a blur now. So basically, you want to be careful about how you define when the pandemic started and when it ended, because there's no, set rule of where when the pandemic started. You just have to be clear about that definition. You could, use some of those hard dates, like when New Jersey officially required schools to go all virtually or remote. I forget the exact date of that, but I had it in one of my own personal projects or something like that. Potentially could be one date that you want to start by, and then, an end date or something like that. So you could have like a hard and fast date. That's one way to do it. There's no set way to kind of define the start and end date of the pandemic, but you should be clear about the time period which you're studying. Was it the 2020, 2021 school year only? But that's kind of the main key, is to kind of focus that timeline.
Yeah, so as Dr. Reid mentioned, there are sort of some general challenges with no matter what your research paradigm is when you're looking at something related to the pandemic. And so some of this is going to be maybe a little bit repetitive, and that's sort of by design to kind of underscore just sort of like how important these things are, and sort of like how to keep this in the back of your mind for if you're doing something that touches on the pandemic or its effects or components in some ways. So one thing is, and Dr. Reid hinted at this, is like very carefully define what you mean when you use the term pandemic. So there was a whole list of things that we kind of colloquially or conversationally talk about and think about when the pandemic comes up, right? So there are disruptions to childcare, there are changes in instruction, there are changes in health risks, there are changes in teacher preparation protocols and programs, changes in testing. So there are all of these different things that are, and they can be very different. And so no one study is going to be able to look at all of these different things. Like you can't just say like, I'm going to look at the pandemic and all of its components. So think carefully about which piece you're really looking at. I would say for most people, and this is just in conversation with folks in class and my dissertation mentors and stuff, mentees and stuff like that. I think some of the most common things really have to do with pivots in instruction, meaning they're going to be looking something about the pivot to pretty much all remote instruction in early 2020, and then maybe when that starts to kind of fade away during the 2021 school year.
Ms. Walton, please call me, Ms. Walton.
So if that is your focus, then your study is going to look a little bit different than say something about how, because the pandemic also affected families who have young children and ran into childcare issues. Both of these things are related to the pandemic, and so you want to be very clear in your framing and in your research questions, really what you're looking at. So specificity and clarity. And just as sort of a thought exercise, that might be worth just kind of, taking some notes, or even like making a diagram, like a family tree kind of looking sort of thing, to try to get, more and more specific about what it is that you're studying. So you could be looking at families, you could be looking at students, you could be looking at education leaders, you could be looking at schools as sort of units, you could be looking at communities that are served by school districts, you could be looking at teachers. So just like think carefully about which aspect of the pandemic, and then sort of which individuals or entities that you're studying, and their try to learn about their experience through the pandemic. Number two here is to be very careful and consider what are the most relevant comparisons. So this is advice that I commonly give, and I think most other people commonly give, and that is, you want interesting variation somehow. So if you're doing something qualitative, you want to get different experiences and use that to better understand some sort of phenomenon, right? You want people with different experiences. In quantitative land, there are times when you want you want to look at differences and use that to draw some sort of an inference about the world. So differences in places that shifted to remote learning early, or places that shifted to in-person learning faster, or something like that. So you want to be able to make some of these sort of comparisons to the extent that you can. However, because the pandemic hit fairly rapidly, and I say fairly rapidly because we're really a span of maybe a month from like there's this new disease in China to schools are kind of shut down everywhere. So and that that's pretty quick, and so any sort of study that looks to make comparisons between pandemic and non-pandemic conditions is going to be very difficult. Because Dr. Reid hinted on, are people going to really remember things very well from like, before pandemic times? And, depending on your definition, are we in a post-pandemic period? And so that, that could be considered, non-pandemic conditions now. So that is a really important challenge. And this is really relevant to those of you who are thinking of what's the effect of the pandemic on X, Y, or Z. Anything that has some sort of a causal flavor or causal bent to it. And by that, I mean, if your research question includes words like effect, cause, produce, impact, lead to, any of those kinds of phrasings and words sort of suggest something sort of causal. And so that adds an extra layer of difficulty because you need to be able to make some pretty precise comparisons. And I have here as a last case, this is something to keep in the back of your mind, is a descriptive approach could be more appropriate in some cases. So what I mean by a descriptive approach would be, so like, let's say that someone has a question of, I'm really interested in the effects of the pandemic on teachers' mental health. Unless you know of a place where you can get measures of teachers' mental health before the pandemic, you're probably not going to be able to answer that question. Just there's not sufficient data to actually be able to know the answer to that question. But you could take that and kind of pivot and just say like, okay, so I want to understand teachers' mental health during the pandemic. And then so that's shifting to being more descriptive. So you want to like learn as much as you can about teachers, mental health and the factors that are related to it potentially and stuff like that. But you're kind of bracketing and saying like it's during the pandemic, sort of acknowledging, I can't get the data that's going to let me see how much did this change because of the pandemic, but it's still important to document their experiences during the pandemic. So that's what I mean by potentially pivoting to a descriptive approach. Another thing that's going to be really important because of these challenges that Dr. Reid and I have hinted at is really be thoughtful about the limitations of your work. There's always limitations, that go along with any piece of research, but especially the many features of the pandemic sort of add additional limitations. So that would be, do you have enough data? Do you have the right kind of data? Is your research question, really acknowledging the important part of the pandemic? And being able to really like understand and delineate all of that is going to be really important. And so that's especially the case in a phenomenon like this, where everybody has kind of different experiences, and so they're going to kind of read different things into, when you use terms like, how did the pandemic lead to X, Y, or Z? So understand, be very precise about what you're doing, be very thoughtful on what kind of data you might need, and really think through the limitations that are out there. So those are kind of the big three buckets of, just general sort of ways to think about these challenges to help you kind of move forward in the research process. So now I'll turn it back over to Dr. Reid to talk more in more detail about how qualitative researchers should think about doing research during the pandemic.
Great. So all of you have probably taken your qualitative research class or one of them at this point, but briefly, you can go to the next slide, Dr. Burns. Just very briefly, qualitative researchers, if you're thinking of doing a qualitative design for your dissertation, you're generally trying to better understand some phenomenon, someone or a group's perspective on a phenomenon or a situation or an experience, or you're trying to better understand a specific context. Qualitative research is really good at kind of getting that nuanced information that might not lead to, generalizable results like some quantitative research can, but you might be able to do a really in-depth case study about how one school or school community experienced COVID in this situation or the pandemic in this situation. Qualitative research is really good at kind of uncovering the nuance and depth of experiences of individuals. That's kind of the goal. And a lot of research is actually coming out now on this topic that Dr. Burns and I are presenting on, and researchers kind of across the board agree that qualitative research is really well suited to explore different facets of the pandemic, because it's really important that we understand, excuse me, how people experience these changes in policies and practice. And you can apply that to, school very literally, like lots of policies and practices changed, of course, in the K-12 or higher ed landscape, but also just kind of in life. But basically, people's experiences are more important than ever as we try to piece together what just happened for the last couple of years here. So qualitative research is a potentially really fruitful avenue to kind of answer some of these questions and make sense of the last 24 months and how individuals, groups, organizations experienced the pandemic. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this line of inquiry using qualitative methods is a really good approach, potentially a really good approach to studying certain aspects of the pandemic. And as you know, you can do this in a variety of ways. Qualitative researchers collect all sorts of data from, we have individuals use documents, do a complete document analysis for a dissertation. I had a really strong dissertation done last fall, I think, where a student looked at parent involvement plans. Last week? I meant last year. Parent involvement plans of a district. So, didn't talk to anybody, looked solely at the documents that the districts had to post about parent involvement in schools and compared that to what was actually going on. So you can use documents, you can do interviews, surveys, more common. Of course, now as things get back to normal, somewhat, you can go into schools, potentially do observations, see people. Qualitative research is really well suited to study people and phenomenons in their natural setting. And we'll talk more about that in a minute here. But there's lots of opportunities to study the different aspects of the pandemic using qualitative research. And I would argue, and this is a little bit of my opinion, but I think most on this call would probably agree that most of you want to study something to do with education, at least relatedly, if not directly, and that understanding education stakeholders, defined broadly, meaning students, parents, guardians, anybody who has some contact or stake in schools, but better understanding their voices and experiences can really add to helping us make sense and better understand what happened during the pandemic. Basically, these nuanced, individualized insights are really important, and there's a lot of avenues you could potentially pursue to better understand various topics under the umbrella of the pandemic. So those of you, many of you had me for qualitative research, and I know not all of you did, but we talk about some of these things these challenges of doing qualitative research generally when there's, this is pre-pandemic, just in some of the challenges of qualitative research in general. And these are kind of the ones that individuals who are writing about this have pointed out and are real as a result of the pandemic. So one important one is this idea of confirmation bias, and that's the idea of most students and a lot of researchers want to study something they are interested in. It makes sense. You need to sustain yourself and finish the dissertation, and you might be interested in studying something that's impacted your career in education, and that's completely fine. But you need to make sure that you're not looking for stories, experiences that align with only your experiences. You interview people and ask potentially leading questions, or you only hear what resonates with your previously established theory or something like that. So applying that to the pandemic, you need to be very willing to accept answers or responses that might be very different from your personal experience with the pandemic. Like maybe you had one very specific experience with the pandemic that was very negative. You experienced a lot of loss, different challenges, all these different things. But the people you talk to in your data as your participants might have a completely different experience. And you just need to be open to that experience. Not everyone's experience is the same, of course. And that's kind of the beauty at qualitative research. You can get very different perspectives on even, let's say, two teachers within one school could have experienced virtual teaching and learning very differently. Right? One could have had great successes, other could have struggled, something like that. So you just need to make sure that as you're going about this research, you're not looking to confirm what you already believe or already know from your experience. You're really listening to the data that you're collecting. One of the strengths of qualitative research is this idea of reflexivity. And one way you can really kind of engage in working towards credibility or trustworthiness in your finding is practicing reflexivity, which is really reflecting on the entire process from the questions you're asking to your participants, to how you're analyzing the data, to going through and what you're looking for. You don't necessarily have that amount of time right now, as much time as you might in other situations. If you're studying what's going on kind of in real time in the pandemic, That's another challenge. One of the major challenges, although this potentially is lessening a little bit now, is that for a while there, the students who were doing qualitative research the last couple of years, producing dissertations and other research, couldn't go into schools for the most part. All the interviews that I did for my personal research or that my mentees did were virtual like this over Teams or Zoom or something. So you kind of lost that face-to-face contact. You couldn't do observations. Maybe you could do a virtual observation or something like that, but it's very different than sitting in a classroom and watching what's going on. And I know many of you experience that too, especially as, in your own professional world. So you're kind of excluded from the natural setting that is one of the strengths of qualitative research. And one of the hallmarks of qualitative research is this extensive and intensive time in the natural setting, whether it's in the school, in the classroom, talking to people one-on-one, those type of things. So that's kind of lost. And that's not a deal breaker. That's kind of just what happened. But if that you're still experiencing that, it's just important to acknowledge that and write about that. So you need to be very clear and detailed about how your interviews were conducted, the limitations of your work, kind of going back to what Dr. Burns said at the top. You have to just note all of these things. It's not a reason to not pursue this line of inquiry or avoid qualitative research, but it's a challenge that was not necessarily experienced before. Some people argue, and I didn't put this on here, but it is potentially an opportunity as well, because you might be able to now access a population that just practically you couldn't before, right? Like maybe you weren't going to be able to drive all over the state of New Jersey to do one-on-one interviews with people down in Atlantic City, South Jersey, everything. But now you might be able to contact them and do these type of Skype, Zoom interviews. So you might be able to actually access a larger pool if you're able to get participants to agree. So that's potentially one opportunity, is you might be able to get more participants in your study, potentially, just one idea. On that same line, in that same vein of participant recruitment, I think it's important to know that, and many of you are probably experiencing this yourself, or certainly have sometime over the last couple of years, but individuals, especially those who work in schools, are really facing this increased stress and pressure and don't have a lot of extra time on their hands. So it's just important that the researcher, you're responsible about kind of what you're asking of the participant. So it's important just to think that how much time do you actually need? What questions do you need to ask them? If people say no, don't take it personally, that type of things. During normal times, it's difficult sometimes to recruit participants to participate in a study because everyone's very busy. But I think that's more true now than ever, that people have a lot of demands for their time. They might not be in the right, if someone had a really terrible last 24 months of personal loss, family tragedy, those things, they might not want to reflect back on their experiences of teaching in the pandemic because it was the worst couple years of their, maybe professional life, personal life. So it's just important. You won't know those things necessarily to every participant you're reaching out to, but it's important to be sensitive of those things as you're crafting everything from who you're going to talk to your research, your interview questions, etc. So think thoughtfully about participants and participant recruitment. That's kind of the short way to say it.
Yeah, something that just to piggyback a little bit on the topic of confirmation bias, something you mentioned, Dr. Reid, is I had seen, I think this was an academic, but I think I saw this on Twitter, but they were doing something and were sort of surprised to learn that they were looking at higher education. And so we tend to think like, pandemic, bad, bad, bad. But sort of what they had found is that there were some folks in higher education who actually did much better than they probably would have otherwise. So like the idea was that single people who don't have a lot of attachments, the pandemic, the way that it kind of shut things down, allowed them to actually be sort of more productive. But then at the same time, folks who had other kinds of obligations experienced, a whole different set of challenges in addition to their normal sort of work obligations and whatever. So if you went in just thinking like this is all bad, you might miss some of those stories of like, actually, I got a bunch of stuff done. That you might not pick up on that.
Great. So despite all of those challenges, those are kind of included or assumed, I should say, in some of the research that you will be doing for qualitative research. There's ways to overcome them. And I said it's not a way to you shouldn't avoid qualitative research because of that, but you can use these strategies to help overcome those challenges. Use peer debriefing. That's literally working with a peer as you begin to kind of analyze your data, test any theories that you're developing from the data. You can work with, I know not all of you have a mentor yet. Some of you will be getting them this summer, but as you get a dissertation mentor, he or she can certainly help with that. But using peer debriefing, so you're not doing everything alone in isolation by yourself, is one strategy. collecting documents and artifacts that are considered raw data. So that would be like interview recordings, the actual words said by the participants, like actual physical documents of things that happened is one way. So your analysis is not yet applied. You're looking at actually the raw data. That's another way. Conducting member checks is something I talk about when I teach the qualitative class a lot, and that's literally following up with participants in the study to see to ask clarifying questions or to get clarity on a topic. You should not make assumptions based on a quote that a participant told you during an interview. You shouldn't assume that he or she meant something by that. If it's a little ambiguous, you should follow up with them and ask, did you mean this? Could you give me some further explanation on this? It's very common in qualitative research, and I would argue more important now than ever. Establishing things like an audit trail, like how did you get from point A to point B? Not only how you collect the data, but okay, I collected these interview transcripts. From these interview transcripts, I came up with these codes. From these codes, I came up with these theories. Having some process, so it's not just like, yeah, I talked to 10 people and this was the general takeaway of what they said. Qualitative research analysis goes beyond that. And then this is important always in qualitative research, but this idea of triangulation. You don't have to triangulate your data in qualitative research, but it is a way to add credibility or, again, trustworthiness to qualitative data collection and analysis. And that's using more than one method to kind of get at a research question. So that might look like observing teachers and then also interviewing teachers. So you could compare kind of what you saw during your observation to what teachers told you in an interview and see if those data sources kind of matched up and what you saw versus what you were told kind of align, or which would be kind of add some credibility to your study, or if potentially what you saw was very different from what you were told. That's potentially really interesting too. You could write a little bit about why there was some misalignment between these things. So those are kind of the main strategies that you could use to potentially overcome some of the challenges I spoke about a couple minutes ago.
Great. So I'll take over and talk more about things to think about if that are a little bit more particular to folks who are doing something that would employ quantitative research methods. So like Dr. Reid, I'll start by just kind of hearkening to thinking about like what are the strengths and sort of requirements of quantitative approaches to research. So, generally what you're trying to do is, or some of the things that you can do rather. So in quantitative research, you can describe patterns in some measure or some outcome, some variable across a population. So describing just like this is kind of what it looks like. You can also identify relationships. And then you can estimate, we have the tools to estimate how likely is it that the relationships that you see are just the product of chance. These relationships can be used to do things like make predictions. So like, let's say you wanted to understand, like folks in political science have done this to kind of understand what are the factors that predict a school staying closed at the beginning of the 2020-2021 school year. So like that would be making a predictions, like what factors predict that a school began that school year virtual. Under certain assumptions and with the right kind of data, you might be able to argue that a relationship you find is causal in nature. So again, meaning that B followed A only because of A. Like were it not for A, B would not have happened. That's what we mean by causal, by something that's causal. Usually these are what we're interested in, like just researchers are most interested in causal kinds of questions, and you students from my conversations, this is also the kind of stuff that you're most interested in, but it's actually the hardest kind of research to do in quantitative, from a quantitative perspective anyway, because the assumptions that you have to make for causal inference are hard to meet. For many different reasons specific to the pandemic, and there's a lot of data that you would need. Some other things to kind of keep in mind. So aside from the strength of quantitative research, these are some other things just keep in mind as you're starting to, looking to get a study off the ground. So one is that you need a sizable data set. You'll notice that I don't give like you need this many data points to be able to do something quantitatively, because unfortunately there's not like a grand rule of you must have this many lines in your spreadsheet or something. But I'll say like you want a lot of data. So for instance, most likely you're going to need more than one school. If you're talking about students, you're probably going to want multiple schools. If you're talking about something with teachers, to get enough teachers in a data set, you're probably going to need multiple districts, most likely, unless you've got a very large district, for instance. Other thing to keep in mind, and this is both a strength and something to just kind of keep in mind, is oftentimes in quantitative research, we're using secondary data. So this just means data that someone else collected, that you're not going out and collecting data. You can, but most of the time that we're not. And so the relevant part of that is, if you're using data that someone else collected, you're kind of relying on their decisions about what to measure, what to actually put into the data set, and what to not measure, meaning what to leave out or what to not include in the data set. So here are some challenges, particular challenges for quantitative researchers. So missing data. Because we're, most of the time we rely on secondary data. So this would be things like the State Department of Education collects all kinds of data routinely about K through 12 schools. The federal government collects all kinds of data routinely about K-12 schools and higher education. Some states collect a lot of data about, colleges and universities. And some of that was suspended, meaning it just didn't happen for some period of time. So for instance, for the 2019-2020 school year, most states administered their standardized testing in March, which is typical. And because that happened to be basically right when the pandemic set on, the U.S. Department of Education waived the requirement that states administer a lot of these tests. So for 2019-2020, in most places, there's just no test score, if that's an important outcome or an important variable that you would want to be able to use in your study. It's not there. And because of that, there's some things that we just can't know. Like what percentage of fourth graders were proficient in math in 2020, in the spring of 2020? We don't know. And there's really not really a way to know that, most likely. If you happen to know, this doesn't mean that it's unknowable. Like maybe you're lucky and you know of a place, a school or a district or something, and they administered, say, NWEA test in the MAP, the measured of academic performance, I think is what that means, which the state doesn't collect, but districts can choose to do this as sort of like diagnostic and to track their students. And if, say, they administered that in February and you can get access to it, then you can use that. But it's I would say when I say you're lucky in doing that, it means like it'll be very hard to learn these kinds of things. Challenge number 2, measurement change. So what this means is that some variable or some piece of information was collected during the pandemic, and it's part of this normal routine data collection, but it means something very different during the pandemic than it does outside of the pandemic. So for instance, attendance. Right, so I'm thinking mostly in the K-12 space. So attendance normally is, teachers every day or every period, they like physically look and see which students are there and which ones are not, and mark the ones who are not physically present as absent and so on. Like that's the way that this is normally done. That's the way it's tracked. The states have very specific rules about when a student can be considered as being present for the day versus when they have to be considered as absent for the day and so on. But starting with spring of 2020 and in a lot of places kind of through the end of the 2021 school year, attendance means something very different, right? Some schools it was, did they log into a learning management system? Did they send an email to a teacher saying, yes, I did my work, I watched the videos, I did whatever. And so all of these different things could be counted as attendance. So what that means is that you have some attendance variable for 2020, 2021, and you don't know how to compare that to 2019, 2020, or how to compare that to 2021, 2022, because it's still called attendance, but it means something entirely different, which makes comparisons really difficult. Measure number 3, which is because the pandemic had many different kinds of impacts or impacted people in a whole different kind of set of ways, the environment can change, which means that even though the definition of whatever variable is that you're using didn't necessarily change, it's going to be different because of just the world was different. So that's what I mean by the environment. It means like just kind of the larger world was different in such a way that the information that you can get from the world is different. So like, for instance, thinking in K-12, the federal school lunch program basically works by students within a certain threshold, under a certain threshold of household income, they qualify for free or reduced lunch. And so there's sort of an incentive for those families who are economically disadvantaged to fill out that paperwork, because then their student will get free or reduced price meals from school. And that percentage of who qualifies for free and reduced lunch ends up being an important thing for looking at economic disadvantage within a school. But for the 2021-22 school year, the free lunch program was expanded so that every student automatically qualifies for free and reduced lunch. So economically disadvantaged families can still sort of get their children can still get access to free meals, but they don't have to fill out the paperwork to do it. And so as a result, the theory, or like, no one really disputes this, so it's maybe a little bit more than a theory, but still a theory, is that economic disadvantage for the current school year, 2021 to 2022, is really undercounted. There are a lot more economically disadvantaged students out there than we know about because they're not filling out the paperwork at the same rate. Another thing could be that for 2020, 2021, so many assessments were still administered during that school year, but if those assessments were administered remotely, then there could be all kinds of other sort of errors. We call them standardized assessments because the idea is to trying to make them as scientific as possible, because you've got the same kind of procedures for how the assessment is administered and how students complete it, and then how that data is collected and processed. But in some places, if there are all kinds of shifts, right? So especially for younger kids, now they have to take this through a computer screen instead of being in a room with a teacher where they can sort of fill things out, means that test score might be different than it would be if they had been in a room with their teacher marking things on paper and so forth. Also, an example in higher education, since some folks are interested in that too. So like the broad impacts of the pandemic may have led to different kinds of folks looking for online education options. So the idea of like online degree programs and things like that have been gaining a lot of interest because they have expanded in size. But because of the pandemic and the larger environment changing around things like childcare and when things were available and who was offering these kinds of programs and stuff like that, that larger environment really shifted such that many people probably started looking for online programs, or maybe even after experiencing them started wanting programs that were now really online to become more online. So these are examples of how the larger kind of environment or the world kind of changing in a way that impacts what the data that you have actually means about the world. And so before we kind of pause and open things up for question and answer, we thought about a few different sort of data sources that might be relevant to those of you who are thinking of research that touches in some way on some aspect of the pandemic. So some things that you might be able to look for. So some of these are qualitative and some are quantitative. So this is a very interesting time, and many of you are practicing educators, so this is not something you don't already know, which is that this is a very interesting time in education, especially when it comes to school boards. And so if you're interested in something that involves school boards, many places have recordings of school board meetings at the very least, because of laws around public meetings. They have to make school board meeting minutes publicly available. So you should be able to find that and to be able to use that as data. School board meetings, like you can listen to what people say, you can sort of watch how people interact if things are recorded, and all of this can be analyzed in different ways. You can look at, and you could even frame things out. Like you might be really only interested in the public comment portion of school board meetings. You might really only be interested in sort of the way that school boards are deliberating and they're using information, say, to make decisions about when and whether to reopen or something like that. Schools and districts had to have these instructional plans or restart plans. So the state required districts to come up with these plans of how are you going to keep kids safe and keep kids and staff safe, and how are you going to get them back into schools, and what are going to be the relevant sort of factors when you're making these decisions. So you might be able to find these from LEA, means local education agency. So that would be like your district, or charter schools operate as a district in many cases. In the state, unfortunately, I have not found where the state keeps these plans that districts have to come up with, but they are out there somewhere. And then lastly, this is a data set. This would be just for quantitatively, or folks who are interested in quantitative methods. So there's the COVID-19 School Data Hub, and they've got the web address in there. So this is was a project run by Emily Oster, she's an economist. I think she's a health economist. I'm sure at some point you came across some of her work, because she was, like, really, as the pandemic started, trying to gather information on understanding, was it, when and under what conditions would it be safe to reopen schools. And so she wound up writing some pieces for The Atlantic and was put on a lot of like news shows and stuff like that. So you probably encountered her at some point. But she has now made their data on their open closed data publicly available. So you can go on there, and they were periodically tracking which places were open for in-person instruction, were they hybrid, were they fully remote, stuff like that. In New Jersey, I don't know everything that's in there, but I took a quick look, and they don't have school level information, but they do have district level information over time. So, and this would be primarily for the 2020 to 2021 school year. So if you're interested in something that involves, which schools and districts were open and closed, or when they opened and closed, or how long they were open and closed, or something like that, this could be a good resource for you to look at. And there might be other things that would be relevant to you there, but that could be a good data source. And would be much better than you having to dig through a bunch of different school or district websites, because New Jersey has between 500 and 600 districts and about 2,500 schools. And to the extent that you can avoid having to go to that many websites to scrape data, I would recommend it. So I'll pause here before we go to question and answer to see if Dr. Reid has any other thoughts or comments on places that folks might look for data to help understand some facet of the pandemic.
No, I think that's a great start. Absolutely.